Dear friends, grace to you and peace from our triune God, who created us and all that is, who saves us from danger and death, and who calls us and empowers us to be part of God's redemption of all things. Amen. In the first reading for this Sunday, the prophet says, "Come to the waters." As you can see, I did. And in the gospel, Jesus heard the news of John the Baptist's beheading, and he withdrew to a boat near a deserted place. And as you can see, I did that too. I'm rather relieved this week that the readings don't include the stoning of Stephen like they did a few weeks back, or the cursing of the fig bush. While I'm making this message hundreds of miles away in a different place, we are still connected and drawn together through Christ's living Spirit. That connection that we share is not limited by distance. It's the same connection that we share with the great cloud of witnesses to Jesus who lived many years before. So I send my blessing to all of you, and I look forward to being with you again. That said, I'm really enjoying the waters and the beauty of God's creation here in central Minnesota. I enjoy this place abundantly. As a young person, as an adult, and now into my 5th decade, I still enjoy this place abundantly. It's simple and quiet here for the most part. I get no phone service. Thank you, Sprint, I guess. When I'm here, I'm reminded that I don't really need phone service or great technologies or things to do or many of the things in life that I busy myself with. And I enjoy this place because it refreshes me to be here. There's something in our readings this week about refreshment, too. The Lord promises refreshment for a parched people in the reading from Isaiah. The people of God had been in exile for many years. God spoke the invitation of abundance and restoration to people just before that exile ended. "I will make with you an everlasting covenant," said the Lord, recalling an early covenant with Abraham. The Lord spoke of David, too, who had God's love securely and, despite his worst efforts, maintained favor with God. Hear what the prophet wrote. "See, you shall call nations that you do not know, and nations that do not know you shall run to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you." That is word of refreshment to a people who were parched. Parched for a word of hope they could trust. Parched for food that satisfies after chasing food that did not. Parched because of judgment that was soon to end, because God was doing something new. And the people of God were invited to come and see. The invitation is sacramental to our ears because it's an invitation to eat and to drink. Come, drink of the waters. Come, buy food, wine, buy without price. This is an invitation also to enter into a relationship with God that is new, that assures God's remembering God's own covenants. We might hear the words of God in the prophet this way: "Take and eat. Do this and be confident that I remember my covenants and keep my promises." David was blessed. He was elevated among the people and even among the many kings. He was a testimony to God's power and grace, a testimony for the nations to see and witness. To a parched and broken people longing for restoration and refreshment, the Lord remembered the covenant. To the parched and broken people, the Lord spoke words of promise. "I will glorify Israel again, but in ways beyond even those of David." God's people will themselves invite nations to come and share the blessing of God. The world, because of God's people Israel, will come and receive. The nations of all the world, because of God's people Israel, will hear and believe. Of course, people didn't believe it. The message was not received with belief. But as the prophet spoke to the people, little did they know, King Cyrus of Persia was already defeating other nations. The Medes and the Lydians were falling to him, and soon Babylon was in his grasp. Their freedom was coming, liberation was coming, and deliverance. The invitation of God and the refreshment of God's people was near. We hear refreshment in the gospel too. In the first place, Jesus withdrew. News of John's death had reached him. King Herod beheaded John the Baptist, and Jesus must have reacted with sadness. Matthew said he withdrew by himself to a deserted place. Matthew doesn't say why, but we can speculate. Maybe he hoped to avoid a similar fate himself. Maybe he simply wanted to grieve. That's an option I think is likely. Perhaps he wanted to reflect, to pray about what John's fate could mean for his own future. So Jesus withdrew to a deserted place that wasn't deserted for long. News of Jesus kept spreading, and crowds were never that far from him. In his own compassion, Jesus offered refreshment to hungry crowds. The miracle feeding that we hear in today's gospel is a story of compassion. Jesus had withdrawn to a lonely place when he met a large crowd, but he had compassion on them. Maybe they were like others in Matthew, like sheep without a shepherd, or maybe they were just hungry. Jesus ministered to their needs in the story we hear today. There is no scene more generative of compassion than that of hungry people. Men, women, and children need food. All of us do. And hungry people move us to compassion like nothing else. The church has always accepted gladly as part of its mission the feeding of hungry mouths. Followers of Jesus have always taken seriously a charge to feed others. I don't mean to confuse you by jumping between Gospels, but in John's Gospel, Peter is told 3 times by the risen Lord, "If you love me, feed my sheep." Feeding is part of what the church does. Compassion begins with our most basic needs. And the church has for centuries fed those who are hungry, though not perfectly, or even sufficiently, or even consistently. But it's important, and a ministry to hungry people can be a central identifier of Christian ministry. Today's gospel is a story of compassion, and it demonstrates the kind of compassion churches have tried to model for generations. The gospel is also a Eucharistic story. That's particularly true of John's gospel, but as we hear this story in each of the gospels, we can't hear it separate from the practice of Holy Communion. Listen to this language. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Did you hear? He blessed, broke, and gave. That is the language of Holy Communion because of this story, which presaged Christ's Last Supper and the words of institution as we practice our Eucharist still to this day. We hear in the gospel a story of compassion and a story of the Eucharist, but I want to encourage you to hear this story in connection with what we've heard the past few Sundays, reading in this Gospel of Matthew. We've heard some of the parables about the kingdom of heaven. In those parables, Jesus has tried to teach the crowds about God's kingdom. We can hear the parable of the mustard seed as Jesus takes a small amount of loaves and fish and multiplies them to abundant refreshment. The kingdom of heaven produces a plentiful harvest from the smallest of seeds, remember. Here's the proof this miracle shows. Jesus provided both teaching for people's spiritual health and food for their physical needs. Abundance begins with small things. I think there's a lesson for us who are trying to be Christ's church for the sake of the world, even in times like this of pandemic and new ways of being church together. We might glean a lot from this ancient example to address 2 major issues in our society today: healthcare and hunger. The present COVID pandemic has really brought to our attention the broken healthcare delivery system in the United States. The way that we care for our sick today is broken. Are the appropriate resources allocated to this care? Does it meet the needs of most, if not all, of our citizens? Is it affordable for most, or is it a luxury for those who are wealthy? Should health insurance be tied to employment at a time when so many have lost their jobs or have been furloughed, who wonder whether their jobs will survive the pandemic? Are we more concerned with political party affiliations or seeing the sick healed? Are we more concerned with money and profits or seeing the sick healed? Jesus, moved by compassion, healed the sick, and we should do likewise. Today, we can advocate for a system that is more akin to the kingdom of heaven and less like the ancient Roman imperial system that God's kingdom so opposed. The coronavirus is exposing troubling disparities in our healthcare delivery system. We can all advocate for improvements. We can learn from this tragic and trying test of our system that we're all participating in. The numbers indicate pretty poor marks if the idea is to keep people healthy and to save lives. There is still a need, too, to feed the hungry in our world today. We've seen this need highlighted in our time of pandemic. Long lines form at food distribution centers across the country. Unemployment has caused many who never thought they'd need a food shelf to find one and to turn for assistance to those food assistance programs. Food insecurity is a reality for many who have never faced that fear before. What are we as Christians doing to feed the hungry? Many churches have kitchens that supply food and provide meals for those in need. How can and do we contribute to those efforts? ELCA World Hunger has been giving special grants to ministries that feed people in this time. Prince of Peace was fortunate enough to receive a small grant to support our social club from ELCA World Hunger. Your offerings support this and other church-wide resources. They are taken by the church, blessed, added with the gifts of others, and they can bring forth an increase. Gifts, along with advocating for and supporting programs that feed the hungry, are ways that we too can bring forth God's kingdom on the earth. And remember those parables, how the kingdom of heaven can be present in the smallest seed, the little bit of yeast that leads to large increase. In the kingdom of heaven, there is compassion, resources are shared, and there is abundance for everyone to be refreshed. I'm not sure what refreshes you, but we all have needs. It's so good to hear that Jesus knows our needs and that Jesus has compassion. Jesus acted out of his compassion to help the crowds. It's also good to be part of a church that has compassion for the needs of others and acts out of that compassion. I might even say that that's refreshing. Dear friends, wherever you are today, however you are, may Jesus grant refreshment for all of you, for your body and for your soul.